Hello world, let's talk about babies, the baby part of the human reproduction cycle. So let's start out just with something to make you smile. Here's a picture of a little baby and it says, "Glad to be out, I was running out of womb." Funny. When you've just been born, but people are already judging you based on your APGAR score. In case you've never heard of that before, the APGAR score is what doctors and nurses use at the beginning, just after birth. And is the baby pink or is the baby blue? Is the baby breathing? Is the baby not breathing? And basically, a perfect APGAR score means that you're alive and healthy. So, people already judging you. Okay, so let's talk about how to get pregnant, and then what happens after you get pregnant. So, pregnancy can occur after any kind of sex, including the first time you have sex. This has been an unpleasant shock to many people, but there is no kind of sexual contact that can occur between a biological man and a biological woman that cannot create a baby as long as sperm is pregnant. And sperm can be pregnant without actual, penis and vagina kind of contact. It could be spread by a hand, even. So there is basically anytime there's sperm, there's a potential to impregnate. And the first time you've had sex, I mean, girls as young as 6, obviously being, abused by someone much older than them, have gotten pregnant. It's very rare. But when a female's body is able to release an egg, anytime after that, she is able to have a baby. So in some species, besides the human species, ovulation can be induced by sex. In fact, in some species, it must be induced by sex. They're called obligate. Anyways, don't want to get into that. But humans, generally speaking, a woman's cycle, about 28 to 30 days. A woman's cycle is generally speaking going to be regular. Ovulation happens about day 14. And there's actually some evidence that for example, if a man and a woman are married, sleeping together every night, the presence of the male pheromones that the woman is smelling regularly all night long or whatever actually regulates her hormone cycle. So they've done tests where they scrape the sweat off of men and then they gotta love these scientists. They scrape male sweat off and then they put it on sticky tape and they taped it under these women's noses. And they discovered that women that had male sweat taped under their noses all night, their menstrual cycles actually changed after that happened compared to the control, which I don't know what they scraped to put under the women's noses for the control. It's probably just water. But so the male pheromones that a man exudes through his sweat, his smell, can actually change a female cycle. And not only that, but there's some evidence that, men and women have brains, right? We're not just animals. And so there's some evidence that a woman's cycle, excuse me, can actually shift to get pregnant in order to get pregnant. And you see this in, evidence where the soldier is going off to the war, and so the husband and wife have one last fling, and even though it happens, 8 days before she's supposed to ovulate, in fact, she ends up getting pregnant because her body actually shifted ovulation to the point within the 5-day window. Remember from our last thing we talked about male sperm survival rates. Sperm can survive for 5 days. So if a woman's body is, you know, stimulated by sex, then it can actually induce ovulation early. So even if you know when you usually ovulate, if you know your body and you say, well, it's always day 14, it's not a clock. You're not a clock, okay? We are massively complicated chemical physical machines that are affected by many, many things that we don't even know about. That example with the male sweat under the woman's nose, that should give you an idea that there are so many things going on, you cannot assume that you know when you ovulate. There's no guarantee of avoiding pregnancy. So the best bet to know your ovulation for a woman to see if she's actually fertile is to use some kind of ovulation monitoring system. And some women, like I mentioned in the previous video, some women seem to be able to ovulate twice in 1 month, which is kind of crazy and cool. And you can look that up if you want. Now, obviously, we talked about how incredibly complex and complicated the process of getting a viable egg out to be able to be fertilized by a sperm is. And so it's very easy for a lot of things to go wrong with that system. We talked in our last video about stress, that stress can actually eat up the necessary progesterone to keep the pregnancy going and turns it into the stress hormone cortisol. So that can actually cause a woman not to be able to sustain a pregnancy, even if she does get pregnant in the first place. There's some other causes right here. Premature ovarian failure. This was almost unheard of until the Gardasil vaccine showed up. It is now a known side effect of the Gardasil vaccine. Gardasil is the vaccine for HPV, human papillovirus. And one of the side effects of that vaccination is premature ovarian failure. What that means is that when a young girl gets the vaccine, her ovaries die. And it used to be almost unheard of, and now the rates are ridiculously high compared to before because it is a side effect of the vaccine. It somehow, supposedly preventing this virus, actually kills a woman's ovaries. This is why Gardasil has been taken off of the shelves in countries. Whole countries have said that that vaccine's not allowed in there anymore because of these kind of crazy side effects. Anyways, so that can cause a woman never to get pregnant again. Or ever. There is some evidence in the United States that if you look at the rates of pregnancy before the Gardasil vaccination started, and after, there has been a significant drop in women's fertility in the United States since Gardasil started being used on young girls. And it's a little bit early to tell right now, but as this was only, 15 years ago or so, but as women get older and as these young women who got the vaccine and then are now finally starting to start families and then realizing they can't actually have kids, it's going to become probably more and more aware that the side effect was wider spread than people realized. Okay, now there's several STDs that cause significant scarring, even if the STD, the sexually transmitted disease, the woman was not aware of it. She didn't have any other side effects or obvious symptoms showing she had it. You'll have your chlamydia and your gonorrhea. Those are two big ones. They actually cause scarring on the inside of the fallopian tubes, and that makes for an extremely dangerous condition because a woman can actually have her egg get fertilized, but the fallopian tubes are so scarred, the egg gets stuck in the scarring of the fallopian tube after it's fertilized, and it will continue to grow in the fallopian tube. This is called a ectopic pregnancy. And if that happens, the woman's life is in danger because as the fallopian tubes are not meant to grow to hold a baby, so they will burst if the baby gets big enough there. And that causes significant internal hemorrhaging and a woman can actually die. And so that not just interferes with the pregnancy, but can actually cause death. This is why chlamydia and gonorrhea are potentially fatal to a woman. STDs can also, these particular STDs can also cause problems for men as well. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, a lot more women have this than they realize. You have cramping that doesn't seem to be normal, cycles that seem all over the place. Eventually, what happens is the woman gets to the doctor and they diagnose her with cysts on her ovaries. Generally speaking, they're not cancerous, they're benign cysts, but what they do is they wreak havoc on her body. And her ovaries can grow to like the size of grapefruits or things, and they have to actually be removed sometimes because of how bad this gets. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, that's terrible, and it causes a lot of problems getting pregnant. Endometriosis, this is a weird thing, but what happens, I think I showed you guys in the last video where we talked about the female cycle. There are little fingers that lure the egg from the ovary into the fallopian tube down to the uterus. What can happen in rare times is that uterine tissue, that endometrial lining, can migrate up the fallopian tubes, out of the fallopian tubes, and go somewhere else in the woman's body. It attaches itself somewhere on her body. Unfortunately, while attached in her body, it still acts like it's in the uterus. So it still builds up uterine, endometrial tissue, and then it tries to shed the endometrial tissue, except it's shedding it into the body cavity. It could have, landed on the bladder or some intestines or something. And so, in response to the woman's hormones in her bloodstream, it continues to act like endometrial tissue in the uterus, except it's outside. And this can cause incredibly bad problems. So, obviously, getting pregnant is going to be one of them. Like I mentioned, stress can prevent a woman from getting pregnant. It messes with the hormones. It can prevent ovulation, or once ovulation's happened, it can prevent the implantation successfully of a healthy baby. One of the things a lot of people don't realize is that you can actually not be able to get pregnant if you're too heavy, if you have too much fat on your body, or if you have too little. A woman's body is designed to only get pregnant within a certain weight range. And if her body is too skinny, she won't get pregnant. If it's too fat, she won't get pregnant. And that's to protect herself and the baby. If she gets pregnant when she's underweight, the first 3 months of the pregnancy, where she could be losing a lot of weight because of morning sickness, could actually kill someone who's already underweight. You need to have a certain amount of fat to successfully carry a baby. And so either of those issues can cause problems. And finally, of course, using hormones will mess with the delicate balance of the birth process, getting pregnant process. Now, men also can have problems impregnating a woman. So several health conditions cause male sperm count to be so low that natural sex does not result in a baby. Now remember I said that, each ejaculation can contain up to 50 million sperm. That's a crazy amount of sperm. However, most of them have no chance whatsoever. They die on impact, basically, because of the acid and the immune body cells in the woman's vagina, etc., etc. And a lot of them may not have working tails. So viable sperm, of the 50 million, the viable sperm might be 1 million or 5 million or whatever. And that number can be lowered even more, so that the point at which the man can actually impregnate a woman via sex, he doesn't have enough viable sperm. So any of the male reproductive organs can be infected, obviously. Just like the woman's. Cancer, certain kinds of cancers will make it so that a man is no longer virile. Virile means he's not sterile. Sterile means you can't make a baby. Virile means you can make a baby. Damage of man gets kicked in the privates, and that can actually literally crush his testicles and damage them. A lot of drugs like marijuana, for example, lowers sperm count, and certain body issues like celiac, diabetes, some medications, all of these can make it so that a man is not able to impregnate a woman successfully. So all of these things can cause problems getting pregnant. For a woman and a man to get pregnant. This is why the assisted fertility industry has incredibly grown in the last 30, 40 years, because a lot of people are, staying single longer, and when they do get married and want to start having kids, that they tend to be older, and that also has an effect on their actual fertility, as we saw at the andropause and menopause. Both men and women experience a decline of hormones as they get older, and that is going to also affect whether or not a pregnancy is possible. So I thought this was kind of funny. If you've never heard of baby fever before, that's when a person wants to have a baby. And it's when you told him you had baby fever, and he said, "You better take some children's Tylenol then." So obviously the wife wants to have a baby and the husband doesn't in this particular picture. So let's talk about pregnancy. The human gestational period, gestation means the baby's growing inside the mother. So you can have cat gestation, dog gestation. Gestation simply means the time that the baby is growing inside. So human gestation lasts 38 weeks. But why do you hear 40 weeks all the time? That's because when a woman goes to the doctor and they don't say, "When did you conceive this child?" What they say is, "When was your last menstrual period?" LMP. And that's because, as I said, many women's bodies are different. They may not necessarily have ovulated on day 14. So it's easier for keeping track to just count from last menstrual period. But if you remember from our women's cycle, the last menstrual period happens 2 weeks before ovulation for most women. So that's where you get the last 2 weeks. 40 weeks. So 2 weeks when the woman is not pregnant, and then 38 weeks where she is pregnant. So that's a little confusing. Pregnancy does not always last 38 weeks. For example, twin pregnancies usually get to about 34, 35 weeks. And then because there's so much baby in there, the woman tends to go into labor early, or often many doctors induce labor or do a C-section for twins rather than allow the woman to continue on in her pregnancy naturally. Although I happen to know quite a few women who have given birth to twins at 40 weeks. It's not easy because you are carrying a lot of baby by that point, but it's certainly possible. Um, some women tend to always have their babies a little bit early. Some women tend to always have babies late or longer than 38 weeks. It doesn't, the 38 weeks is not like written in stone. Most first-time mothers, when they actually give birth, is between 1 to 2 weeks after 38 weeks has gone by. So there is no standard. There's no, okay, this is wrong now. Um, it's just an average of how long it takes to grow a baby. So that 40 weeks or so is broken up into 3 trimesters for ease of talking. And each trimester is about 12 to 14 weeks long. The fourth trimester is a term for the 3 months after birth. And that's just to recognize that the 3 months after birth is an incredibly um, changing and different period of a woman's body than any other normal part of her life. Her body takes at least 3 months to kind of get back into what's normal for the hormone levels to go down. And so that's called the fourth trimester. Okay, so just so you know, any natural death of the child before 20 weeks, using the 40-week LMP counting, is called a miscarriage. Although if you looked at it on a medical certificate, it would be called a spontaneous abortion. And what that means is that if the child has died or the body detects that the child is not viable, the theory goes the body decides not to continue the pregnancy and aborts the child. or miscarries the child. Now, this could be because there's a genetic defect. This could be because the woman has a hormonal imbalance. For example, progesterone could be too low. And so some women who suffer a string of miscarriages, 1, 2, 3, 4 miscarriages, they go and get tested at the doctor, and then they finally discover they would have been able to keep all of those babies alive if their doctor had checked their hormone levels and discovered that their progesterone was too low and started them on progesterone supplements. Now, you remember that progesterone gets converted to cortisol in the body. So if a woman is stressed out, the progesterone her body needs in order to keep the baby going, to keep the pregnancy going, could be getting used up by stress. And so it's very important for women to get their hormone levels checked while pregnant, because you can save a pregnancy if you supplement with progesterone if that tends to be too low in that particular woman. So this is one of the reasons why prenatal care is so important, because then you can have a good idea of where the pregnancy is, if it's healthy, how the baby's doing, and if there needs to be hormone supplementation. Okay, now a natural death between 20 to 40 weeks is called a stillbirth. That means the baby is born dead. Now, I have actually had both of these kinds of losses, pregnancy losses. I've had a miscarriage and I've had a stillbirth, and they're both extremely horrible. Um, After 20 weeks, the baby is big enough to hold in your arms, and it's obviously a baby. There's no mistake. You see the little toes, you see the little fingers, you can count all of that good stuff. Um, and so that is a stillbirth. And unless it's a very early miscarriage, so before, about week 8, even so after that, like my miscarriage of my baby that died around 12 weeks, and then I miscarried at 14 weeks, which would have been a miscarriage versus a stillbirth. When my baby came out, I was able to hold him, and I could tell it was a him, and I could see all of his legs and toes, and he looked just like the adorable little baby. So um, anytime a baby comes out early, they still look like a baby. They're not a clump of cells. That's something that's important because of the misinformation that's widely spread. Now, the intentional death of a child at any gestation is called abortion, or it's called murder. There was a recent case where a woman took an incredibly, ridiculously high amount of illegal drugs and killed her child. And when the child was born, they tested the child and discovered the amount of drugs in the child's body was so incredibly, insanely high that there was no way she accidentally overdosed. And so they discovered she was intentionally trying to murder her child, and so they charged her with murder. It is still in every state, it's still, if someone tries to hurt a pregnant woman, or if the pregnant woman tries to hurt herself in order to kill the baby, that's still called murder. There's been times when, a woman's partner doesn't want her to be pregnant, so he starts beating her in the stomach until he kills the baby. Okay, that's also called murder. So challenges during pregnancy. Pregnancy is, I've said usually, let me just tell you, it's always uncomfortable. Sometimes it can be outright painful just existing as a pregnant woman at some point during the pregnancy. I mean, you basically blow up like a balloon. Your abdomen is like you've got a beach ball going on there. And so that is a lot of challenges that can be faced during pregnancy. So the normal kind of things that you're going to have, having a lot of stomach acid, having your joints start creaking and cracking and all that stuff, that's normal. Now, the big deal stuff that can be a problem during pregnancy, hyperemesis. That means that a woman throws up all day or every day of her entire pregnancy. It's normal for most women to throw up in the first 3 months, the first trimester. It is not normal for that to continue on throughout the rest of the pregnancy, and if it does, she has what's called hyperemesis. And there's some drugs that can help that. There's some dietary things, but it's a very horrible, big deal issue because a hyperemetic woman might not be able to take in enough nutrition to survive. And so sometimes she has to be hospitalized. Gestational diabetes, that's the where you get diabetes while you're pregnant, you didn't have it before. Diabetes obviously has to be managed if you have it. Preeclampsia, which is where your blood pressure starts spiking really badly, and if it turns into full-on eclampsia, your life is in danger. And the only way to cure that is to have the baby. SPD, we talked about SPD when we were talking about mental health stuff. That was sensory processing disorder. In this case, it means symphysis pubic I don't know. What it stands for is that the two bones of the woman's pelvic girdle begin to separate at the symphysis pubis, which is the pubic bone, right? The bone right, in front. And they're only knit together by tendons, and tendons get loose during pregnancy. So once they begin to separate, that is incredibly painful because walking, if you can imagine if your two pelvic bones start, rubbing up against each other and clicking when you're walking, you can just imagine how painful that is. That's a problem. Because of the induced autoimmune issues, not autoimmune, because of the induced immunodeficiency issues, the woman's body while pregnant intentionally knocks down her own immune system. It's on purpose so that her body does not reject the child. And so that's all part of normal pregnancies. But because her immune system is low, it's very easy for her to get infected by things her body would have normally been able to fight off. So UTIs, which is urinary tract infections, that's very common during pregnancy. Thrush, which is an overgrowth of fungus, that's common. You get all kinds of opportunistic things going on during pregnancy. Anemia is possible. That's where you have not enough oxygen being carried to the blood cells because of the blood issues. And you can actually have bleeding in the placental area. That's called placenta previa or placental abruption. If the placenta separates from the uterine walls before it's supposed to, that's called placental abruption, and that's life-threatening. Because anytime the placenta separates, there's a lot of blood. That's why a lot of blood happens after birth when the placenta is delivered. If that happens before birth, the amount of blood that can be lost is so much blood in such a small amount of time that this actually can kill a woman if she is not immediately put into surgery. Okay, so those are the big deal issues, the stuff that's like, yeah, boy, this is the big scary stuff. Some other things that are not like going to kill you but can be really bit of a pain, varicose veins. So your veins get swollen and painful, and if your veins in your vulvar vein area, that's your privates, if those get swollen and painful, it's like, oh, can you imagine? Like it's ugh. You also have sciatica. That's where your back gets messed up, and so your nerves start pinching. Extreme fatigue where you can't get off the couch. Lots of fun stuff like that. So those are the bad things about pregnancy.